Hey, everybody, welcome to the Daily Objective. And we got a special sponsored episode today. Phil, the avid viewer and commenter, has sponsored today's episode. He asked us to watch a YouTube video titled Government by Decree, COVID-19 and the Constitution by Lord Sumption. Lord Sumption. We're going to be, we watched it. We're going to talk about it. It raises not only the issue of COVID regulations and restrictions, and they're bordering on authoritarian measures, but also it raises the question of England's sort of, I guess, unspoken constitution as opposed to the very explicit written American one. So a lot to talk about today. And with that being said, thank you, Phil. And if anyone else wants to sponsor an episode, please go to IronRandCenter.co.uk. Some link in the chat and link in the description, and click the contact tab to get in touch with us. So you can propose an episode, either topic or you want us to review something, and all of that will be discussed. Thanks again, Phil. And now let's meet today's host. We got a guy. Not only is he joining us over the internet, but he's actually in a car, which I presume is self-driving. Please welcome Satan himself, Mark Pellegrino.
What's up, Rucka?
Not much. And all the way from Greece. That's right. Okay, now apparently he's in England. This guy just cannot settle down anywhere. Thank you, COVID. Please welcome Nikos Sotirakopoulos.
Thank you. So, and many thanks to Phil. We really appreciate this very generous contribution. So we cannot assume that the audience has watched this speech. So this was a speech that Lord Sumption, who is someone who has sat on the Supreme Court, who is someone with a lot of legal prestige, has given to the Cambridge Law faculty towards the end of 2020. And I have to say, by the way, hat off to Cambridge for hosting such an event. I can't think that it would be easy to host it in most of the universities. So as you said, the title is Government by Decree, and I'm going to give an overview of this talk, and we're going to stop at the important points, and the co-hosts can join us. So he begins by saying that what we've seen, and again, this was given in around towards the end of 2020, he says what we've seen is the most significant interference with personal freedom in the history of the country. That's how he begins. And that's very important, because when you get too much into it, when you get too much into the details of the pandemic, like when's my vaccine? Is this country an amber country or a green country? How do I have to do 2 tests, or do I need to test in day 8? In all these details, quite often it's easy to lose the big picture. And Lord Sumption says that the big picture is that no matter how big and tragic the pandemic was, we also have to keep in mind that what we've seen here is the most significant interference with personal history. Not since the end of the Second World War or something, but he says in the history of the country. And he gives us his first example. He talks about the first 3 months, the period of the first lockdown, where he says we have the weird situation where it's not that the government is stopping you from doing some things. We have the situation where the government qualifies you to do only limiting a number of things. So we have this reversal where the government is not telling you, don't do this and this. The government is telling you, stay at home, and you can do shopping, walking once every day, if I remember well. And in particular cases, you can, if you're a key worker, all that stuff, maybe you can do some more stuff. So he brings our attention to this complete reversal of the role of the government. So this is the big picture. This is how he sets the tone. And the second way in which he sets the tone is that let's remember what is the essence of the political system in the UK. And he also brings some examples from the Brexit discussion, which in his mind, the government had too much power. So he says we have the executive and we have the legislature. We have the government and the parliament. And he says, quote, the dependence of government on parliamentary support was the means by which the policies of the executive are subjected to consideration by the representatives of the electorate. So this is something to keep in mind, that the governor has not got unlimited powers, but the governor has to be checked by the parliament, and the parliament is, let's say, the body of we the people. And also, because this is a country without a constitution, all these principles are based on custom, which basically means are based on our will, our willingness that there's something good here and we need to preserve it, and we need to take this into accordance before we take any decisions. So this is how he sets the tone. Biggest infringement of our freedoms in history. And keep in mind that this is a country where you are representing the parliament, and he's about to say the parliament had basically zero role in any of this. So if anyone wants to jump in this kind of stage setting, or do you want me to go on?
Well, I'm assuming he's the professor of medieval history, so he probably knows better than I, but I thought pre-Glorious Revolution, Parliament, was disbanded at the will of the king at times, and didn't have the kinds of powers that we associate with a parliamentary or free society today. So it was a very heavy charge for him to say that this is some of the most egregious government overreach in the history of England. England's got a pretty long history of some intense political controls over the citizens of England. And I think maybe London was sort of an outlier, right? London was sort of an independent sphere within the battling kingdoms and politics there. But that's a huge thing to say. Do you agree with that? Even pre 1688.
Look, this was a live speech, so I'm not sure if he would write the same thing. He would write a treatise about it. But I agree with his spirit. His spirit is he wants to shake us in the beginning and say, people, something important happened here, and because you were into it, you didn't realize exactly what happened. So I could imagine you saying, look, someone in my shoes in 50, 60s, 80 years, the historian is going to be, what? So this is his spirit. I agree. It's probably, even under lockdown, maybe it was freer than, I don't know at what point in the 14th century or whatever, but I agree with his spirit. The spirit of the historian says, take a bit of a bird's eye view and see what happened here.
Yeah, I mean, you said maybe it was freer than, the 14th century or something. There's no question that life today is much freer than the vast majority of the past. I mean, it's less free than a couple of years ago, obviously, but definitely we need to hold things in context. Like I've always said, whenever this whole East Germany talk would come up, I would say, you're told stay home, order in carryout, order in food, order in Amazon, hang out on the internet and watch Netflix until it's clear that the virus is under control. We can disagree with that, but that is not the same as it's not nowhere comparable to the medieval times or anything like that. I mean, but the thing with England too, it's it's such a weird development of history. It's you can almost never really quite identify when one era ends and the next begins. In America, we've got a clear date when documents were signed, when a new country was established. These things are explicit, and they're explicitly in the Constitution and in the amendments. Whereas England, it just seems to be this kind of weird, it's this process of evolution. You can't really tell when they stopped being apes and began being humans. It's just this slow, gradual process.
Well, I think there are at least a couple of distinctive times. There's the Magna Carta and there's the Glorious Revolution for sure. And a couple of other, I think, pinnacle moments that define the evolution of England's government. I would certainly say it's probably the biggest overreach in the 20th and 21st century. We could say the 20th century, since the 20th century, perhaps. I don't know. I don't want to piddle about something that doesn't matter and I don't know a great deal about. So, I mean, I'm assuming as a professor of medieval history, he knows it better better than I do.
And notice that he says the biggest interfere with personal freedom. He doesn't talk about political freedom. He talks about personal freedom. So I will cut him a lot of slack on that statement because I get what he means. Okay, let's proceed. Then he talks about how these measures were passed. Now, just setting a stage here, a big, not disagreement, a big objection, let's say, I have on this approach is that, of course, Lord Sumption is a legal scholar, so there's too much emphasis there on the legal details and all that stuff. Whereas my take would be, look, history is written by ideas. History is written by what is the culture in a society. So I'm less shocked, to put it this way, by Lord Sumption, by everything that is about to follow, because I think society was completely ripe for this. So he says, so all this restriction was based on 3 legal texts. The first was the Coronavirus Act, which is a document of 348 pages with 102 sections. And it was passed in the government within a single day, which means that basically no one read it, which means that people said, oh, something needs to be done. Yeah, vote for it. And this reminded me the period of the financial crisis in Greece, where the European Union would send us texts that were literally that size of pages, and they would go to Parliament like that, and no one would have any chance to read them. So Lord Sumption says, don't think that the people in the Parliament actually have much idea about what is happening. The government told them do something, and they did it. And then there are 2 more legal documents. By the way, though, he says, this wasn't the strictest one. This wasn't the one that says you are locked at home. So this was combined with the Civil Contingencies Act of 2004 and with the Public Health Act of 1984. So he said that if you put these 3 legal documents together, there is some semblance where the government can say, yes, I can find a window to tell you can stay at home. Whereas he says, in none of these 3, you see explicitly allowing the government to do what it did. They just give the government a leeway to take actions. So his main issue here is the government should not consider that they have the action to do indiscriminately what they're technically not barred from doing. So I don't know if you get it. The government is not technically barred from doing the things the government did, but also the government is not explicitly allowed to do the things that the government did. Now, again, I find it a bit too technical because the population was begging for even harsher measures, and I think this is for me the key ingredient here. But that his point is that that's how you get. That's how we got here.
Well, I just want to piggyback on that because you're right, Nikos. It is about the ideas that drive society. We have enumerated powers. We have a written constitution with enumerated powers. That means the federal government can't step over those powers. It can only do what is written in the Constitution. And yet, because I think the culture has been evolving towards a kind of radical democracy, the politicians have been given a pass to subordinate the enumerated powers to the will of the people, or the perceived will of the people. And that's enabled them to widen the scope of their powers over the last 120 years. In many respects, we're very much like England, except we have a written constitution that we should be referring to and really aren't.
And then he goes on, Lord Sumption, to say, see how this overreaching of authorities spills over to other areas. And he brings the example of one of the bills that were passed that allows the government to have a statutory, so basically they allowed the government to overspend as much as the government wanted. And he said that there is a quote, the result was to make an additional 266 billion available to the government with no advanced parliamentary scrutiny. These measures departed from a century and a half of constitutional principle by which Parliament controls exactly how public funds are spent. And then he says, but that's not only it. Then we had this gray area of government, quote, advice and government nudging. And other bodies then jumped in. So, for example, the limit to access to the doctors, to the general practitioners. Even today, you try to see a GP in the UK, they probably gonna book you a meeting through Skype or something. And this was a disaster because many people missed diagnosis for much more serious, statistically serious illnesses than COVID. And statistically serious, I mean with chances to kill you. And he also brings the example of the dental practices, where basically for months you could not go to your dentist. I remember in the first lockdown, one of my biggest fear was, what if I had a toothache? Because practically all you could do is go to the dentist to some emergency dentist to pull out your teeth. That's the only, you couldn't have an appointment for routine stuff. So he said this ethos, this culture of, yeah, maybe now it's the time to do whatever we think we should do without it, almost arbitrarily, was moved to the state bureaucracy beyond the government, basically to the health system. And then the worst thing is that this was also the case in the police. And what we saw with the police is the police deciding for themselves, for example, what you should buy from the supermarket. So we had some isolated cases, but there were cases of a police officer stopping you after the supermarket and say, why did you buy drinks? This is not essential. Or the police stopping you in a train station and asking you, why do you want to travel? And here's what he says. Here's what he says. He says, also, we gave the police, we destroyed basically, he doesn't use this word, we destroyed the idea of objective law. So when there was some protest by people who were against the lockdown, the police was harsh against them. When there was Black Lives Matter process or Extinction Rebellion protest, no big deal. So then he mentions, quote, a noticeable process of selection was involved in the actions of the police. And basically this means there is no objective law. So Lord Sumption mentions that I went to the BBC and I complained about that, and he received a letter from a police commissioner, quote, objecting to my remarks on the ground that in a crisis, such things were necessary. The implication was that in a crisis, the police were entitled to do whatever they thought fit, without being unduly concerned about their legal powers. That is my definition of a police state, says Lord Sumption.
Agreed. I mean, it's as if the concept inviolable rights have no meaning to anyone anymore. They're violable now if, we now have inviolable rights, but ... If we could come up with a scenario where we think it's, dire enough or a risk enough to the population at large, we won't necessarily bestow the government with the powers, crazy extreme powers, but we'll allow it to happen. They'll certainly take the cues and do it on their own. But inviolable rights mean there are no circumstances under which your rights can be violated. There are no emergencies that can give the powers that be the excuse to come in and violate your rights. There's no crisis where they can do that. There's no quote unquote common need that can allow them to violate your rights. That's the pact you make with government, that they will protect your rights from violation. And that's the most fundamental pact that we make with society. And this is a scary thing that this is happening in England.
It's
supposedly the source of our liberties.
It's important that you say it's the pact that we made with the government, because Lord Sumption is going to come back to that. Rucka, any comment or I proceed?
I mean, it is very shocking. It is very shocking. All of the examples and the stories I'm hearing. I mean, all the practices. It's shocking, like hard to believe that this is happening in the world that we live in. The additional thing I would add to that, which may sound like I'm downplaying it, but I'm really just adding to it. I'm saying we've been regulated economically for over a century. We've been taxed at 50% basically for over a century. In so many ways, people's lives are meticulously regulated and they're basically being harassed full time by the government. A part of me kind of looks at this and says, okay, so now the average person is basically being treated like businessmen, like businessmen or high earners, or just generally businessmen, not big or high earners, but just generally people that are trying to exist. And so along with that, I'm wondering, is all of this shocking? Is this just kind of more of the same? Like, is it just kind of, we're seeing more like short range kind of concrete examples in front of us on a daily basis, things that we've basically been living with and kind of silently accepting, many people, for all of our lives?
It's not shocking to me that the government would take any opportunity it can to expand its powers. That's just what government and the political class does. What's shocking to me here in America, I can't speak for England, but in America, is the way people are giving in. The way, not only giving in, but wanting it, desiring it, wanting the government to take these egregious powers, and claiming that allowing this to happen is the moral high ground, right? If we're not all doing what the government has told us to do, we're not all on the same page. And the people who aren't doing that are the dissenters. They're stupid, bad, evil, and they need to be attacked.
Yeah. Let me jump over to Phil's super chat. I know there's others.
Before we go to the super chat, let me read the next paragraph because it's related to the super chat. So I read the next paragraph and then we go to Phil's super chat because you'll see the theme. So on the United States, we have the Constitution, so it's clearer to find out, oh, something is happening here which shouldn't happen. But how does the system work in the UK? So Lord Sumption says, many basic rights and principles depend on convention. They depend on a recognition, not just the government might act within its powers, but that not everything that the government is legally entitled to do is legitimate. And then he talks about the things that happen. He says, these things should not happen without specific parliamentary authority. So basically he says, this is the shield we have towards this authoritarianism, which is that we have the convention, the understanding, the common understanding, and also the parliament. The parliament is the guardian. Now let's go to the question, which I think is related.
So Phil super chats as if his sponsoring the episode wasn't already enough. Thank you, Phil. He says, I wondered about the poignancy from the perspective of the American hosts, not you, Nikos, about the powers of the will of the people with the written constitution. So he uses these big words like poignancy. What do I look like?
Is that poignancy? Poignancy?
I don't know. He didn't say. Poignancy.
Yeah,
if anyone wants to define, anyway, I'm dwelling on this. We're dwelling on this, but from the American perspective, I think obviously having a written constitution it's prevented definitely the First Amendment from being suppressed, right? But there's a good chance we would have had hate speech laws enacted a long time ago, or just generally speech that is destructive to the community. I mean, pornography came really close to being banned in the past, if I understand correctly. Things like that. But the First Amendment, it's there, it's written explicitly, and it protects. So it's definitely protected. That being said, I think even the written constitution has failed to protect Americans' rights from being violated, because when the whole culture, virtually the culture, agrees that the government should be nannying us and redistributing and taxing and regulating, then
and not only that, but that the written constitution is a living document, which means not just amendable, but fundamentally changeable, as if it's not based on any fundamental principles of governance, and it should reflect whatever the preponderance of citizens believe. That is to say there's actually no fundamental idea governing the ship of state. It's just whatever the current generation feels should be the principles. And you can't, you have no anchor. And society has no anchor in that regard. So it's not even so much what society thinks, it's the philosophical principle behind having no principle.
Yeah, and I will bring here the famous quote by Judge Learnhand, who said, "Liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. When it dies there, no constitution, no law, no court can even do much to help it."
Yeah, and by the way,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I have a hard out in 2 minutes, so if I jump off the call suddenly, that's why. I'm reminded of the in the part of the Leonard Peikoff's book, The Dim Hypothesis, where he describes the American culture, and the impression I get is that he's saying that basically the only thing keeping America from becoming authoritarianism is sort of like the ghosts of the founding fathers in a way, like the spirit of the founders still being in the culture, because it's not the explicit philosophy of Americans that is keeping liberty intact. So there is something about America, in addition to the written nature of the Constitution, that it's not just sort of common law, it is written explicitly, but there's something about the culture in general. America is sort of the don't tread on me type of culture. So if I could have England, let's say, like if England became objectivist, they became real liberty loving, rational people, but they have their unwritten constitution, that to me is way more promising than America's decaying philosophy and sense of life with our explicit written constitution. So at the end of the day, it's the people and their values that drive the culture.
So we're going to say goodbye to Rucka now because he needs to jump somewhere else, but we're going to go on for some more minutes because there's more on the speech. Thanks a lot, Rucka. See you tomorrow.
Yeah, I'll jump off in a moment.
Not tomorrow, but soon this week.
See you soon.
Okay. So then he goes on to say about that's a nice bridge also to what Lord Sumption will say, which is what has been the role of the public here. So he says that the public has unbounded confidence in the benign power of the state to protect them. So what happened then is that, as he says, the government's campaign was so successful that when the government started realizing, okay, this tactic of the strict lockdowns is going to have some very bad effects. But then it was difficult to reverse course because the public said, oh, why? What changed? Aren't we still isn't it still so dangerous for all of us? And isn't your job to protect us? What changed now? And so Lord himself realizes that, yeah, it's actually the ethos and it's actually the culture here which is ripe for this violation of personal freedom. And he says, quote, when societies lose their liberty, it is not usually because some despot has crushed it under his boot. It is because people voluntarily surrender their liberty out of fear of some external threat. And we saw, for example, this external threat in the case of the Third Reich was the Jews. But here, it was the added element that it was an actual threat. It was a real threat, which was an actual, real, and existing virus. So his sad, let's say, not conclusion, because he says something more, but his sad hypothesis is that, yeah, you have basically a government that pushed the state even more towards saying, yes, please do more to us.
Yeah, well, a very dangerous belief is the belief that government is benign. It's not benign. That's why we constrain it with constitutions. That's why we decentralize its power, because we know that it is never benign. It is a beast. It's a predator. It's a carnivore, and it will eat you and kill you unless you cage it. And America at one time understood that, and we understand that less now. Like England, we've been thinking it since government has taken up the reins of charity and become a redistribution mechanism, which has been manipulated to seem as if these redistribution schemes are a means of establishing equity and justice. That makes the government look like Robin Hood, ironically, in the eyes of most people, a benevolent force just seeking justice. That's not what it is. Get over it. It is a killer. Restrain it.
And of course, many objectivists claim that no, government is the necessary good, not the necessary evil. But they're talking about the government as it should be, and as it should be a government protecting individual rights. But historically, we see what you said, Mark, and this should have been the last 18 months, should have been an awakening. Also, note something very interesting. At the time of this speech, I think the violation of the rights were a fraction in some ways of what we see today. So back then, we didn't have these draconian, for example, these draconian limitations on traveling, which again, for me, is the hardest pill to swallow. Notice, for example, the weird situation that the Delta variant is currently almost the sole variant. It has taken over completely in the UK, but we still don't allow travel from countries because we are afraid that they're going to bring in the Delta variant. That makes no sense. And Lord Sumption says this. He says, quote, where is it? Authoritarian government does not mean efficient government. So he says, don't make this mistake to say, oh, now we have a big problem, therefore we need a strong government. As Harry Binswanger said, trains did not run on time in Mussolini's Italy. Trains did not run on time in Soviet Union. Okay, we have more super chats, so I'm gonna hurry up.
Wait, I want Nikos, real quickly. I wanted to jump on that because we objectivists understand that government is a force for good, but it's actually I would put it a little differently, because government is a beast. It's force, right? The only way force can be good is if it's restrained and subordinated to reason, and that's what our Constitution is supposed to do. And government is never good in the sense that it's always force, but we can tame force to work for us, provided we subordinate it to reason, provided we restrain it entirely. And that's what we seem to be forgetting.
Yeah. And Lord Sumption says a couple of more things about how authoritarian government also splits societies. So again, conservatives who you think that what we need is a Caesar, a fractured society is never healed by an authoritarian figure. Check Soviet Union, check Yugoslavia, check Germany itself. So lessons there. Okay, I'm gonna hurry I cannot cover all the points. Then he talks something about the opposition that was completely not only absent, but actually was pushing for more measures. He gives the warning that quite often emergency measures can be in effect for decades. So I'm a bit more pessimist here than our friend Rucka, and he makes some other points on human rights convention versus common law and some other stuff that unfortunately we haven't got time to go through. Again, he suggests some measures, more political participation. I think it would be more or less futile because there is I don't see much popular will out there to resist these things. I mean, there was a protest on Saturday. In my opinion, it was like a freak show. You had people talking about not really lizards, but 5G, super prisons, human experiments. So if this is the opposition to the lockdowns, then unfortunately, we are doomed. No, you have to find it's much worse than you think. It's much worse than you think.
But
okay,
see, we have those conspiracy theorists in America as well, and there's a part of me that sympathizes with them because the media gave up the mantle of truth, and so nobody knows what to believe anymore.
But that's why we have to be extra serious and extra careful not to be like that.
Indeed, but I feel like since they suspect, I think rightfully so, that the pundits in the media are in bed with the government in some way, they're all sort of helping each other along. They're investing in these crazy theories to give them some sense of coherence.
Okay, so let's finish with super chats. Razi, are you gonna paste the super chats or what? Okay, Phil says, Nikos, I have a sense that people have had a quiet coup inflicted upon them. Please tell me why I'm wrong. Okay, I don't know with which, yes, they did have a quiet coup inflicted upon them, but still today, a majority, if we are to believe the opinion polls, is in favor of strict measures. Even if we don't believe the opinion polls, I don't know a single person in my environment in the university who was not in favor of stricter lockdowns. And see the popularity of this government. The popularity of this government is relatively stable. Of course, it helps that the opposition is also bad. So that's why I don't think that there's this massive opposition to, unfortunately, to these authoritarian measures. And the most vocal parts of this opposition, unfortunately, have now made the vaccines part of the culture war, which I think is destructive, completely destructive. They should have left the vaccines out of it, or at least try to stick to some semblance of reason. Jonathan says, who is going to Ocon to party with these guys? We will, if the government, if Joe Biden allows us, because at the moment the borders are closed. Marilyn says, most politicians see the Constitution as a limit on the people, not on the government. They need to read the 9th Amendment. Yeah, and you have the best constitution in the world. You should see the Greek constitution. The Greek constitution, for example, tells you that you cannot have private universities. So the Greek constitution literally tells private individuals what they cannot do, because only the government can do. Corey, whoa, what's this about government not being benign? Have I stumbled across advocates for freedom or something? Yes, Corey, you've stumbled at the best advocates for freedom. Have we got any other super chat, Razi? I assume your silence means no. Okay, so let's wrap up. First of all, a big thank you. Yeah, that's what I said, Corey. Okay, a big thank you, first of all, to Phil. A huge thank you for your contribution. Now, if someone else also wants to request a special episode, please, you have to go to the Lord Emperor. How you do that? You go to the website and there is a contact us form, or find Razi on social media, or if you know him, or write a comment on YouTube. We're going to find a way to get in touch. Also, many thanks to Regina, Sami, LM, and Enric for your contributions. Thank you very, very much. Okay, this was a long episode, but we hope it was worth it. We put, and also thanks to Lou, we put a lot of effort in this. So I hope, I mean, we always do put efforts on the episodes, but particularly today, we hope that Phil got value for his very generous contribution. Okay, very, very short Clubhouse today, because I need to leave it within 15. 8 o'clock UK time, Harry Binswanger comes back. Harry's in a great form in the last weeks. He's in a good form. And today the topic is radical individualism. So join us in 1 hour and 15 minutes. Let's take a stroll at Clubhouse to see what you have to say, to see what you think about this. Do you think that Lord Sumption's approach was a bit too legalistic and he's missing the big picture? Or do you think he's right to ring the bell and say, look, even from this perspective, we've seen something unprecedented? Anyway, thanks to Phil, thanks to all our viewers, thanks to the super chatters, thanks to my co-host. See you soon. Solo episode tomorrow on Cuba and what are the lessons from Cuba's long survival, from someone who was so into Cuba that at one point in life, I had a plan on how to meet Fidel Castro, and I almost put it to action. But more on that tomorrow. See you then. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Nikos. Thanks, Phil.